Hello everyone. So last week I recorded that video discussing some strategies for you to improve your essay writing for paper one. Today the objective is to discuss some strategies to do well in paper two, the data response. So of course, I'm not gonna repeat everything I said on how you expected to write, to use diagrams in an essay, because of course a lot of what I explained in the previous video is also valid for paper two. So if you haven't yet watched this previous video on paper one, you should do it. So then you really have like the bulk of the information, and then today is only going to be about refining those advices and make sure that they are as practical as possible when you answer paper two questions. Okay, before we dive into strategies to answer the questions, let's just recap a few important elements about the format of the examinations, because you know that it has changed over the last few years. So let's just go through the main, like the format of the examination and what's going to happen the day of the exam. One big change that was introduced in 2024 is the fact that now paper 2 is the same for HL and SL students. It's a big change because it means that you will not have any questions that are specifically targeted at HL content. Does that mean that you are not allowed to use HL material in your answers? Well, of course not. If you want to use HL material, if you think it's relevant to support your answers, especially for the final question, question G, the 15 marker, you can, no problem at all. But the questions themselves will not be specifically targeted at HL material. So since this paper has changed a lot over the last few years, and because we practiced all the papers as well, or questions from all the papers with a slightly different format, my first advice for you would be read the instructions. Okay, just to make sure that you do the right thing, that you understand what you have to do in terms of how many questions do you have to answer, how do you round your decimals, numbers, and so on. Basically, let me summarize like the key elements that you will find in the instructions, but again, make sure you read them again. So you will have 1 hour, 45 minutes for this exam. And they are like the maximum number of marks you can get for this exam is 40 marks, which means that on average, you should spend between 2 and 3 minutes per point. Okay, it's always a good idea to have that uh, value in mind. So then when you have like a definition that's like which is a 2 marker, you know that you should spend roughly 5 minutes on the definition, roughly 10 minutes on a diagram that counts for 4 marks, and so on. Okay, so it's very important that you manage your time well. So keep that in mind, 2 to 3 minutes per mark. You are allowed to use a calculator, okay? So do not forget this calculator in the exam. Whenever you have to round numbers, you have to round the number keeping 2 decimal places. Okay, so something like 17.79, 324.19, something like that. Okay, 2 decimal places. You know that in paper 2, there are quite a few questions that involve calculation. You are required to show your work. So it's not enough to just write the answer. It's important that you walk the examiner through your calculation process. Like, what formula did you use? How did you use it? Like replacing the numbers into the formula, and what is the final value that you obtain. Okay, but I'll talk a bit more about questions involving calculation. Important, you need to answer just one question, okay? You will have two big questions. So one question is like the text. Often you also have a table with some data. It could be one or several texts actually. Um, and then you have question A to question G for each of these questions. And of course, you have to answer them all. So it could be 1A to 1G or 2A to 2G, but you must answer a single question out of the two large questions that you will have. And of course, in the instructions, you will also be advised to ensure that all of your diagrams are clearly represented with labels everywhere, so it's as clear as possible and as easy as possible for the examiner to assess your work. Okay, so that's what you will be reminded of in the instructions. Next, obviously, the next task that you will have to complete is to select which question you are going to answer. Don't rush this process. You know how important it is. There are multiple strategies to do so, but perhaps one that probably works quite well is by looking at the questions first, like not reading the information, the text, looking at the data before you actually understand what is going to be expected of you. So start by looking at the questions for question A, the questions for question 2. This might actually be enough for you to determine which question is going to be the most suitable for you, because there might be some questions that you really do not understand for one, and that for the other you might feel like much more confident, much stronger. I would also encourage you to attach particular importance to the questions G, 1G and 2G, because you know that this question counts for 15 marks, almost half of the total number. So keep that in mind, because it's just one question out of 6, okay? But almost 50% of the total grade. So you should really compare these two questions, 1G and 2G, to determine which one seems to be the best for you, for which question do you feel like you have the most knowledge. Of course, you will use the information that is provided, but it's important that you feel confident discussing the concepts, the policies, and so on that will be required to answer the question. So perhaps just reading through the questions will be enough if there is like a clear imbalance in your level of mastery of question A versus question 2. If you are still hesitating between question 1 and question 2, then of course it might be necessary for you to actually read the information, to read both text, or like all information that is provided to you, in order for you to give more context to the questions that you have already read, because perhaps you did not understand the question properly because you had not yet read the information provided. So again, if you feel like you are still on the edge, by hesitating between question 1 and question 2, read the information at least once, and then hopefully you should be able to make a choice. But again, do not rush that process. Feel free to allocate at least 5 minutes, possibly a bit more, to ensure that that decision is the most suitable. Okay, so you've read the instructions, you've selected a question, so you are ready to start. If necessary, again, it's up to you. I'm not saying that there is a single recipe to do well in that exam, but if necessary, feel free to read all questions again, and feel free to read like the text and look at the tables once again. So you have like a clear understanding of what is expected from you and where in the information you can find either the data, or like the information that is required to answer every question. It's going to save you time, especially when you answer question G. In terms of the questions, there are, uh, let's say, three main types of questions, apart from question G, of course. So what we're going to do now is just to look at each type of question one by one. The definitions, which is going to be the type 1, calculations, type 2, and questions involving diagrams. Okay, so from question A to question F, these are like the main format, the main types of questions that you may encounter. So let's look at each of these type of questions one by one. So you will most likely have two key terms to define, each of them scoring up to 2 marks, so 4 marks just for the definitions. You will be indicated in which paragraph the key term that you're expected to define is being used. So doesn't cost too much to read the paragraph, just in case. Read the paragraph from which the key term was extracted, and because it's going to provide you with some context in case the definition can be ambiguous. You know, sometimes in econ words can have like multiple meanings. So reading this paragraph is going to provide you with like clear context, so you know exactly what you're expected to do. When you write your definition, make sure you use keywords. Okay, like the typical mistake that students make is that they give like a definition just from the top of their mind. They just try to explain that, but you without using economic terminology. So you are expected to define words using economic terminology. Let me just give you an example of a definition that would not use the appropriate terminology and one that would. Let's just say you expected to define monetary policy. Okay. You could say like someone who would define it without using economic terminology could say something like, oh, so monetary policy is when the country decides to change the interest rate to change the amount of spending in the economy. Okay, so it's not like wrong, right? But you see what the problem is. It's not like very accurate. It doesn't sound very precise because there are important key words, adjectives, nouns that have not been used properly. A better definition, of course, would be something like a monetary policy is a demand side policy that is designed and implemented by an economy's central bank. Sentence 1, it aims at shifting the economy's aggregate demand through changes in the money supply and the interest rate. Okay, you see how I used key terms: demand side policy, central bank, aggregate demand, money supply, interest rate. That's what you have to do. If your definition is too vague, or if it's a definition that does not use the proper terminology, even if it's like, let's say, okay, like not wrong, but you will most likely not get full marks. Usually in the mark scheme, if you look at the mark scheme, it really works by key terms. You see, like, oh, award 1 mark for saying it's demand side policy, 1 mark for saying that it's about changing the money supply. So make sure you you feed the examiner with those keywords, so the examiner can just confirm that you get full marks for this. Okay, honestly, not I don't have much else to say on definitions. 2 marks, I would suggest, yeah, one sentence could be enough. But if you want to be safe, you could actually write two sentences if you want to make your definition a bit stronger, a bit more comprehensive. It may sound like overkill, but come on, these are easy marks to gain. You don't want to lose marks on definitions. Okay. Second type of question that you may, that you will, that you will face. Usually that's question B. So it could be B1, B2, it doesn't matter. But that's typically the questions where you actually have to calculate something. Remember, you have to round your answers to two decimal places. So let me repeat it. Could be something like 27.69, 250.08. Okay. Do not forget units. The IB is a bit, how can I say that? Sometimes they try to trick you, right? They try to trick you by providing data that have different units. Like a typical example would be they give you data on population and it's measured in millions. And you have GDP data measured in billions. And if you're not careful, if you fail to recognize that, well, these are different units, if you just divide or you like use the data without acknowledging this difference in units, well, of course, you will not get the right answer. Okay, so careful with the units. And when you find a result, ask yourself, okay, does it make sense? Well, frankly, if you find like a GDP per capita in Somalia of $160,000, that's weird, right? So also try to ask yourself, does the data that I have make sense? I know it can sometimes be difficult to assess, but like roughly, does it make sense or is it completely unrealistic? Okay. So careful with the units, careful with the rounding. In terms of how you expect it to write um, your answer, you should always start with the formula that you're using, okay, to explain, okay, how am I going to proceed? So it could be like if I have to do a real, let's say GDP per capita, that's the easiest formula. You say, okay, I have the total GDP, I have the population, then I just divide real GDP by the size of the population. Boom. If you need to calculate the PD, so okay, the PD is the percentage change in quantity demanded over the percentage change in price. Okay, so start with the generic formula. That's stage one. Stage two, you write the formula again, but you replace with the values from the data. Okay, instead of just writing percentage change in quantity demanded, it could be 120 minus 100 divided by 100. Okay, something like that. If you have like the GDP divided by population, could be 160 billion divided by 60 million. Okay, careful with the units. Okay, so you replace in the formula, you replace the elements of the formula by the values that are provided either in the text or in the tables. And then last stage, you just write value, like the result. Be extremely careful again. Make sure you indicate the unit. Okay. Is it, are we talking about like dollars? Are we talking about like bushels of wheat? Are we talking about kilograms of iron? So also make sure that you are as precise as possible. Okay, the answer is not just a number. It's a number of something. There are some exceptions, of course. If you're looking at if you're calculating an elasticity, you know that an elasticity does not have um, like a unit. Okay, we say it's unit free or it's dimensionless. It's just a value. Same thing if you look at something like price, like the CPI. You know that the CPI is just a price index, so it's not something that is measured in dollars or whatever currency. But usually, when you calculate something, you often have to calculate elements that do have units. Let me just quickly have a look at some of the questions. Okay, so you have like the percentage change in real GDP, so it's going to be as a percentage. I'm just browsing through questions from past papers, so I can't really display them on the screen because I can't share them. Calculate the revenue earned by a company. So it's going to be in, let's say, dollars, euros, pound. A trade balance, again, it's going to be in billions of a given currency. Income elasticity of demand. Oh, this one will not have any currency. And value of net income from abroad is going to be in billions of a currency. So you see, be very careful. Really make sure you understand what you are calculating and make sure the unit is included. Okay, forgetting the unit is like if you forget a label on a graph. So you're just showing something, you have a number, but you don't really indicate what that is. Okay, for the third type of question that you will encounter, so that's usually question C to question F, they usually involve diagrams. But it could be a question where you just have to draw the diagram without explaining anything, without commenting. These are usually the questions that start by sketch, like using, not using, just sketch a diagram representing blah, blah, blah. Okay? And again, in this type of question, they always indicate in which paragraph, where in the information you will find context for this particular diagram. So make sure you read the paragraph again, just to ensure that you understand precisely what is expected from you. Then again, just read the question well. You have those two types of questions involving diagrams. The sketch type of question, often 2 marks, in that case, just draw the diagram. The more common type of question is using one type of diagram, and often they tell you what type of diagram they expect: an externality diagram, an international trade diagram, an ASAT diagram. Okay, so they usually tell you. Sometimes they will not. They will simply tell you using an appropriate diagram, and it's up to you to determine which one is going to be suitable. In that case, if they just tell you using an appropriate diagram, it's often because there are several possibilities, and the IB does not want to, well, to force you to use one diagram rather than another. Okay, so don't freak out. Actually, you should rejoice when you see that they ask you something like using an appropriate diagram. It means that often there are several possibilities to answer which are relevant. For that type of question, using a blah 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 diagram, explain blah blah blah, usually 4 marks associated with that type of question. And of course, in this case, to answer those questions, it is not sufficient to just draw the diagram. So of course, you should start with the diagram, but then below the diagram, you should write a comment of your diagram and just explain whatever you are expected to explain. Okay, just briefly, a few reminders on how to use diagrams properly. Again, I explained that in the previous video, but use a ruler, pen or pencil. I suggest a pen, it's just clear. Draw your diagram on a draft, and once you feel confident that, okay, I got it, then you can use a pen with confidence. If you really lack the confidence, you can still use a pencil, but make sure that it's dark enough, okay? So use a ruler, make sure you label absolutely everything. Given that you usually know what market this is, in what country, in which currency, you have much more context than in paper 1. So make sure your diagrams are labeled as precisely as possible. Instead of just quantity price, could be, like quantity of soybeans in thousands of bushels, price of soybeans in, I don't know, like whatever the local currency is for the country that we are studying. So make sure your labels show your ability to apply your knowledge to a specific case. Okay. Label all curves. Make sure you use arrows to identify change. Whenever there is a shift in a curve, you can also use arrows to identify changes along the X and Y axis, a change in price, a change in quantity. Feel free to use letters to identify some areas. If you, for example, want to show a change in consumer surplus, producer surplus, a change in tax revenue, something like that. Highlighting shading areas tends to be messy, or at least it can be quickly messy. So unless you have like a single thing to shade, that's fine. But if you have multiple, it's usually better to use letters to identify those areas. Make sure your diagrams are big enough. Okay, it's pointless to draw like tiny diagrams. So big enough diagrams, center your diagrams in the page. It's honestly for paper 2, it's not necessary to add like a number and a title below, because you're not really going to refer to those diagrams. So it's unlikely you could in question G, but frankly, it's not very useful to add like a number and a title. What am I missing on diagrams? That's good enough. Usually for those questions, you either have to show the effect of a change, so something shifting, usually. So that's why the arrows are essential, because it highlights what is the initial situation and what is the new or final situation. Or sometimes it could be not really a change, but a gap. So something like if you use an externality diagram, you may have to show like the gap between the market equilibrium and the efficient equilibrium. So it's not a change, it's just a difference between two things. You may have to draw a diagram showing a recessionary gap. Okay, so the difference between actual output and potential output, not a change, but just a difference between two things. I think that's about it. And again, please watch the previous video on paper 1 if you want to have more info on diagrams. You can also look at the shared folder in which I have uploaded a document that is called 15 tips to use diagrams like a pro, with like many rules on how to use diagrams properly. Okay, good. So we are ready to start talking about question G, which is like the big one. Before I dive into it, just keep in mind that most of the questions from paper 2 tend to be macroeconomic questions and global trade questions. There might be some microeconomic questions, but diagram-wise, when I went through past papers, the most common micro diagram that you may face is an externality diagram. So yeah, there are high chances that you will be expected to draw an externality diagram. But apart from that, like the micro content tends to be like pretty minimal for paper 2. Maybe some definitions, maybe the calculation of the PD or changes of revenue for firm. But if you look at it overall, most of the marks, or most of the questions, they target content from the two final units, macroeconomics and the global economy. All right. To conclude this video, let me share a few tips on how you can do well in question G. So question G, 15 marks out of 40. So around 40% of your of the total number of marks for paper 2. Make sure you save enough time. Of course, like should be almost, I don't know, like 45 minutes, something like that. I think I said 2 to 3 minutes. So the exact value is 2.62 minutes per mark. So if I multiply by 15, 39 minutes, so 40 minutes. Okay, so 40 minutes should be allocated to question G. Question G is actually pretty similar to part B of paper 1. There are a few differences though, so let me highlight the main differences. Number one, you don't need to provide real-world examples because, well, we are already looking at a real-world example. So it's provided, and it's not necessary to, unless you have like some other examples that might be relevant, but it's not required. So that's the first difference. The second biggest difference is that now it's not just you, using your knowledge of economics and just writing a general essay on an issue without clear context. You are evaluating or discussing. I'm going to give you a few examples of the type of question that you may encounter. Something that happened in a particular country at a particular time for a particular reason. Okay. So and you are provided with information about what happened, about that real world example. And every question G starts in the same way. So let me just read it because it's very important. It says, using information from the text, data, and your knowledge of economics. And, not or, okay? A common weakness of answers to question G is when students only use their understanding and just answer that question as they would answer like an essay question without extracting information from the text. Okay. Um, and of course, you will not be able to reach the top score, top grade for this paper if you do not show the examiner that you have, on the one hand, a strong knowledge of economics, okay, using your knowledge of economics. And again, that's where you show your understanding of terminology. That's where you show your ability to connect economic concepts in a logical way. That's the analysis. This is when you show your ability to evaluate your arguments, to consider the limitations of your arguments, to discuss factors that have an impact on the strength, on the relevance, the validity of the argument that you make, okay, the evaluation. Feel free to watch the previous video on paper one to learn more about the evaluation. I'm not going to repeat everything. So of course, the examiner will assess the same skills as the ones that are being assessed in paper one, but on top of that, number two, they will also assess your ability to extract relevant information from the text to make arguments that are valid in that specific context or to support your other arguments. Okay, so how do we approach these questions? And before I give you some tips, I went through some past papers, and paper G question, they often ask you to evaluate the effectiveness of blah 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 in achieving blah blah blah, evaluate the extent to which blah 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 contributes to something, discuss the impact of something on something. So it's often about discussing whether something is effective or ineffective, whether it's a success or a failure, whether the effects are positive or whether they are negative. Is there a conflict between two objectives? Yes, no. Or sometimes you may be asked to consider various policies or various obstacles for a given objective. So these are the type of paper question G um, that you may encounter. So how do you answer this question? Well, of course, do not rush. Take your time, plan your answer. So I would suggest that it's a good time to read the text again and highlighting some material that seem relevant. Okay, that's still part of the brainstorming phase where you just say, okay, maybe that could help. It's okay if you don't really know yet how you're going to use that particular information from the text, but just read it and say, okay, maybe that's going to be helpful. So try to highlight all the arguments that could support your arguments or even allow you to make new arguments that you perhaps did not think of. Okay, so once you have that, once you have like highlighted the information from a text, you have some ideas that could be relevant to support your answer. Start structuring. So, okay, first I want to talk about this particular argument. Perhaps I can use this information from the text to support it, to explain why it is particularly valid, and then follow the same process as the one I explained earlier on how you answer part B of paper one. Okay, but every time you make an argument, maybe not every time, but as often as possible, try to use information from the text. How do you show that you use information from the text? Well, first, there are multiple ways, but one solution could be simply to write something like as indicated in text A, and then you can simply paraphrase. Okay, so in that case, you don't really need quotation marks. Just explain where you found the information, and using your own word, you can simply like rewrite like the information that was provided. You can also use quotation marks, and I actually like that a lot because it's very obvious that you use information from the text when you have quotation marks. But of course, make sure you quote the information properly, okay? Like copying full sentences is not really the best solution, the best way in which you quote information from a text. Just use what you need, and usually these are just bits of sentences, not even full sentences. Just extract the part that is essential. I think it's great when you do that. Because using quotation marks just makes it very clear to the examiner that you have successfully extracted information to support your arguments. If you paraphrase, if you just rewrite the information, the examiner might miss that it's not something that comes from you, but something that comes from the text. So that's why I encourage you to use quotation marks. Don't quote full sentences, as I explained. And after your quotation marks, you can even open brackets and just write like text A, paragraph 2, just like in the questions, okay? Just to make it clear where you obtained that information. Because it's a discussion, it's an evaluation, so just like paper one, you will have like usually two parts. One part where you're going to say, oh yeah, it's effective, yeah, it's a success, yes, the effects are positive, yes, there is a conflict, oh yes, it contributes a lot, yes, there is a positive impact, okay, one side. And then another part where you will have the other side. Oh no, it could be ineffective. This policy is likely to fail, or the impact is mostly negative. No, I don't think there is a conflict, and so on. Okay, so of course it varies, and you must remain flexible. Make sure that you structure your answer to make sure that it is the most suitable structure given the question that you are answering. In each part, just like for paper one, you should have at least two arguments. Okay. Ideally, each of your arguments should be supported with something that you found in the text. It's no big deal if you cannot find arguments in the text or like material in the text or in the data that supports every single argument. Okay. Just like in paper one, it's okay if you do not support every argument with a real world example, but try to use as much information from the text, from the data as possible. Okay. And again, just like in paper one, don't forget to evaluate those arguments. Okay. Considering the possible factors that may influence whether your arguments are strong, weak, valid, invalid, and so on. Again, watch the previous video. I talk about evaluation much longer. And don't forget the conclusion. Okay? Clearly, you are asked a question, answer it. And if you did everything properly, if you have enough arguments in one side, enough arguments on the other side, if you have they are well supported using the information provided in the text and in the data. If you have properly evaluated your arguments, your conclusion will be finely shaded. What I mean by finely shaded is that basically your answer is going to be, well, it depends, as always in econ, but you will be able to explain what it depends on. And again, a good way to start your conclusion, be ready, that's going to be very surprising, is to start by in conclusion, but then copy the question again. In conclusion, whether or not this policy has contributed to achieving blah blah blah, whether or not this policy was a success, whether or not this policy, whether or not there is a conflict between. Okay, so you just copy the question again, and then you can continue depend on uh, several factors, including first factor, second factor, third factor. Okay, it doesn't have to be three, but you understand what I'm saying. Because yes, the answer is always going to be it depends. and then you just elaborate. Indeed, under these circumstances, we can conclude that the policy is effective, that there is a conflict, that this event has significantly contributed, and that's when you use the evaluative comments you've made previously. On the other hand, under those circumstances, so you identify the parameters that influence the answer to the question, this policy is likely to be a failure, to have more negative effects. This event has not contributed much. Okay, so you explain that the answer is yes under certain circumstances, but is going to be no under other circumstances. What I've just explained over the last 5 minutes is exactly the same as what I explained in for paper one. So yes, there are similarities when you answer paper one question part B and paper two question G or part G. But again, remember, you do not need to provide your own real-world examples, but you need to extract information from the data and text that is provided. Um, you Yes, that's actually is actually the main difference. Mhm. No real example, but use information from a text, quote some sentences, use some data. Make sure that you show that you are able to apply your skills, your knowledge to the specific context that is given, that is provided to you. Okay, I think that's it. I think that's a comprehensive review of everything you need to know before you can answer paper two next week. Have a nice day. See you soon.